It was a typical Saturday morning. The birds were chirping outside, and the sun was barely peeking over the horizon, casting a soft glow over the trees that surrounded my property. I had lived in this quiet, picturesque neighborhood for over a decade, surrounded by nature and the peace that came with living far from the hustle of the city. The land, inherited from my grandfather, was a sanctuary, a place where I could escape from the world, reset my mind, and focus on what truly mattered. My property stretched for miles, enveloped by a natural forest that was both a haven and a challenge. It was my land, and on this particular Saturday, like most mornings, I was preparing for a day of solitude and hunting. Hunting had always been a part of my life. From a young age, my grandfather had taught me the ways of the wild. He had instilled in me a deep respect for nature and the animals that lived in the forest. My hunting trips were not just about tracking game. They were an act of connection to the land and a way to honor the tradition passed down through generations. My days in the woods were my form of therapy, moments of clarity and quiet that could only be found in the heart of nature. But that morning, something unexpected happened that would shake the foundation of my peaceful existence. As I walked into my study, preparing my gear for the day ahead, I saw a letter sitting on my desk. It had a large, official-looking stamp in the corner. My heart sank as I recognized the return address. It was from the Homeowners Association, HOA. The HOA had always been a bit overbearing, as is often the case in communities like mine. They enforced rules about the aesthetics of houses, the color of fences, the height of grass, small, petty things that, for the most part, I could ignore. But their recent push for environmental conservation had begun to irritate me. They were always keen to introduce new regulations, often without consulting the homeowners, and I had begun to feel as though they were stepping into my territory. But this letter was different. This was no ordinary reminder about landscaping or property lines. This was an official fine. As I opened the letter and read its contents, I could feel my blood pressure rising. The HOA had fined me for hunting on my own property. According to the letter, I had violated a new regulation they had recently passed, which prohibited hunting near the newly designated hiking trails. The trails, they claimed, were for the enjoyment of the public, and they didn't want hunters near them for safety reasons. The letter made it clear that I was not allowed to hunt within a certain distance of the trail, which, conveniently, ran through a large portion of my land. The fine was hefty, and it was the first time I felt like the HOA had imposed something that directly impacted my daily life. I sat down, stunned, as I reread the letter. It felt like an attack on my rights. After all, this was my land, my property, and I had always followed the rules laid out in the HOA's guidelines, as restrictive as they were. But this felt different. The land was something that my family had fought to preserve for generations, and now it seemed the HOA was encroaching on the very thing I had inherited. This was no longer about grass height or the placement of mailboxes. This was about controlling how I could use my land. It was personal. I had heard about the HOA's efforts to turn some of the nearby land into hiking trails, but I had never agreed with their decision. The area surrounding my property was beautiful, full of open space and natural beauty, and it wasn't uncommon for people to enjoy the outdoors by hiking or walking. But now that they had officially made a portion of the land a public trail, the HOA had made it their mission to protect the area, which meant limiting any activity they deemed dangerous or disruptive, like hunting. And they had taken it one step further by regulating the distance from these trails within which hunting was forbidden. This was the first time I had been impacted by their regulations directly, but I knew it wouldn't be the last. The problem was that the hiking trails ran through my land. While I had always respected the boundaries of others, I had never consented to the public use of my property for recreational purposes. No one had asked me for my opinion when they created the trails. There had been no vote, no discussion, no negotiation. The HOA had simply decided that the trails would be there, and that was the end of it. I didn't have a say, and now they were imposing fines on me for using my land as I had always done. As I sat there, the weight of the situation began to settle in. This wasn't just about hunting. It wasn't even about the fine. It was about control. The HOA had decided they had the right to dictate how I used my land. They had decided that my traditions and my lifestyle weren't compatible with their idea of a community. And what's worse, they had done it without consulting me, without asking for my permission. It felt like an overreach, an intrusion into my private life. My anger began to build. I had inherited this land from my grandfather, a man who had fought for it and had taught me how to respect the earth. I had spent my life maintaining it, cultivating it, making sure that it thrived. Now I was being told how to use it. The thought of allowing some arbitrary rule to dictate my use of the land felt like an insult. This land wasn't just property, it was part of my identity. It was part of who I was. And I wasn't about to let anyone take that from me. I picked up the phone and dialed the HOA office. My frustration boiled over as I explained the situation to the person on the other end of the line. They were calm and collected, but I could hear the indifference in their voice. To them, this was just another fine, another routine matter. To me, it was a personal attack. After a long and frustrating conversation, I was told that the fine was final and that I had no recourse. The regulations were in place, and I would have to abide by them. There was no room for negotiation. It was clear to me then that this wasn't just about the fine, it was about the power the HOA had over me. They were sending a message that said, "You don't have control here. We do." But I wasn't ready to just accept that. I knew that this wasn't the end of it. I wasn't going to let them dictate my life or my land. The thought of simply paying the fine and moving on was out of the question. No, I needed to take action. I needed to do something that would not only assert my rights but would make it clear to the HOA that I wasn't going to be pushed around. The wheels in my mind began to turn. I had a plan forming, one that would give me back control of my land and send a message to the HOA, but it would take time, effort, and a bit of creativity. I wasn't sure how it would play out, but I was determined to see it through. As I looked out at the land from my window, the familiar view of the forest and rolling hills, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was my land, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me, not even the HOA. The fight had only just begun. In the days following the infuriating fine from the HOA, I spent countless hours fuming in my study, poring over every detail of the situation. As the reality of their control over my land set in, my desire to take back control grew stronger. I realized that my immediate reaction, anger, was not enough. I needed to make a move, something decisive that would not only protect my property, but also send a clear message to the HOA that I was not going to be pushed around. The first thing I needed was information. I couldn't just charge ahead blindly. I needed to understand the situation fully. The HOA had been using a section of land as a hiking trail, and while it was technically not a part of my property, it bordered it, and in my eyes, it might as well have been mine. I'd never agreed to allow anyone to trample through what I considered sacred land, especially when it was surrounded by the very property I had inherited. But the trail had been put in place, and it was becoming more and more difficult to ignore. I set out on a fact-finding mission, researching the land that the HOA had been using. From my initial observations, I knew it wasn't much, just a stretch of open terrain, dotted with a few benches and winding dirt paths. The idea that people were walking through the forest that had been my refuge felt like a violation. I hadn't given them permission, and yet there they were, traipsing across the land. They were enjoying the beauty of it, but they had no stake in it. They didn't know the history of it. They didn't understand its value to me. That feeling of invasion began to simmer within me. Through online databases and some well-placed inquiries, I uncovered some key details about the land. It wasn't owned by the HOA, as I had assumed. Instead, the land was owned by a real estate company, one that had leased it to the HOA for use as a public hiking area. The company had acquired the land years ago, but had done little with it, mainly because it was not located in a particularly sought-after area. The land was underutilized, and the real estate company saw little reason to hold on to it indefinitely. The HOA, desperate for land to expand their community amenities, had approached the company and secured a lease. The deal was simple. The HOA could manage the land for recreational purposes, and in exchange, the real estate company gained a steady income stream without needing to invest in developing the land. I spent the next few days researching the real estate company, learning about their operations and identifying key players within the organization. I discovered that the company was more than happy to let the land go. It had become a burden for them. There was little financial gain to be made from such a small plot of land, and it was clear that they weren't emotionally attached to it. To them, it was just another parcel of land, one of many that they had no personal connection to. The more I learned, the more I saw an opportunity. If the real estate company wanted to sell, I could buy it. If I owned the land, I would have the power to close off the trails, remove any trace of the public access, and reclaim what had always been mine. But there was a catch: the price. The real estate company wasn't going to sell it cheaply, not with the HOA using it, and not without first considering other potential buyers. The idea of buying the land initially seemed far-fetched, but then I thought about the HOA. They had imposed their will on me and my land, and they had done so with no regard for my wishes. I was already paying the price for it. It was time to take control. I contacted the real estate company's sales department, posing as a potential buyer interested in purchasing the land. The conversation was professional, almost too simple. They were more than willing to discuss the land, and they informed me that it was available for purchase. The price was steep, as expected, but it was not out of my reach. The company gave me a rough estimate, but it was clear they hadn't put much effort into valuing the land properly. It was little more than a patch of undeveloped forest with no utilities, no infrastructure, and no future potential as far as they were concerned. Over the next several weeks, I made my offer. It was calculated, reasonable, and more than fair, considering the current state of the land. I knew this wasn't the type of property that would attract other buyers, especially given its location. The real estate company wasn't keen on keeping it, so I pushed for a deal. The negotiations were tough, and there were moments where I questioned whether I would be able to pull it off. But as time wore on, the company began to realize that I was serious. They had no other offers, and they were tired of managing the land. In the end, after a few rounds of back and forth, we agreed on a price. I was the new owner of the hiking land. The day I closed on the deal, I felt a sense of triumph, mixed with a touch of disbelief. The idea that the land I had once watched from a distance was now officially mine was surreal. I had not only taken back a piece of land that bordered my property, but I had done it in a way that no one could contest. I was in control now. My first steps on the property as its new owner were filled with a deep sense of satisfaction. I walked across the land, my boots crunching against the dry earth, the smell of pine and damp soil in the air. The land was wild, untouched by the human hand, save for the small trails that cut through it. The sound of a creek running nearby was peaceful, and the rustling of leaves in the trees above was the kind of noise I had longed for. It was quiet. It was mine. I explored every corner of the land, carefully examining the trails that the HOA had developed. The dirt paths were well worn but not overly developed. There were a few benches scattered around, placed without any particular care. The land was still in its raw, unrefined state, and that was exactly how I wanted it to stay. The thought of people hiking through it for their own enjoyment suddenly seemed like a selfish act. They were walking through something that belonged to me, and they had no idea what it meant. I felt a sense of power walking across the land, knowing that I had control over it now. The realization that I could do whatever I wanted with this space. Tear. Down the trails, remove the benches, or just leave it to return to its natural state, was liberating. This was more than just a piece of property. It was my statement. The HOA had fine-tuned their efforts to limit my actions, but now I had the ultimate trump card. They had no idea what was coming next. I had reclaimed the space they had taken for granted. I stood on the highest point of the property, overlooking the trails, the trees, and the small creek that ran through it. The land was wild, untamed, and beautiful. It was everything I had hoped for and more. But now it was mine to protect. And protect it I would. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, I made my decision. The trail would be closed. I would take down the signs, lock the gates, and make sure that no one would be able to access the land again. The HOA wouldn't like it. They would fight it. But I was ready for whatever came next. I had made my move. And I wasn't going to back down. The days following the completion of the land purchase were filled with a mixture of anticipation, satisfaction, and, admittedly, a bit of trepidation. Holding the deed to the land was one thing. Taking the next step, actually implementing the changes I had in mind, was another. I had secured the land that bordered my property, but now it was time to make it clear that this new ownership would not be taken lightly. The thought of the HOA's reach extending any further into my life filled me with frustration, and I realized that it was time to act decisively. I had been pushed to this point by their overbearing rules, and now that I had the power, I would no longer be passive. I walked the land several times, each visit more deliberate than the last. The sight of the trails that the HOA had established made my blood boil. What once had been peaceful, private land was now an open, public space. People from the neighborhood and beyond had been using it to hike, jog, or just wander, and the thought that I had no say in it seemed absurd. These trails, once imposed without consultation, were now mine to control. The idea of them being freely accessible to anyone who wanted to step onto the property was no longer tolerable. The first step in my plan was to send a clear message. This land was no longer part of the HOA's territory. I started by putting up large, imposing signs at every visible entrance to the trail. The signs were simple, bold, and to the point. Private property. No trespassing. I wanted it to be absolutely clear that anyone attempting to enter was doing so without permission. As I hammered the final stake into the ground to hold the sign in place, I felt a rush of defiance. This was my land, and the rules had just changed. But I wasn't finished yet. The signs alone were a statement, but I needed something more. Something that would truly make the public understand that this was no longer their playground. I decided to add a physical barrier, a gate. I found a sturdy, heavy-duty gate and had it installed at the trail's main access point. It wasn't the kind of gate that could be easily bypassed. It was high, reinforced, and locked with a thick, rust-resistant chain. I felt a certain satisfaction as I stood before the gate, looking at the metal barrier that now separated the public from what was rightfully mine. The land was closed. The trails were closed. No one would walk across it again without my permission. The action I had taken was extreme, but in my mind, it was necessary. I had been pushed to the brink by the HOA and their constant interference in my life. I knew that they would not take kindly to my decision, but I also knew that I couldn't back down. I had taken control, and now it was time to stand firm. It didn't take long for the HOA to respond. Within days, I received another letter. This time, the tone was more forceful, more urgent. They demanded that I immediately reopen the trail to the public, threatening to fine me even further for violating community rules. The letter was full of legal jargon, but the message was clear. They wanted the land back. They wanted their trail back. They wanted to reclaim what they felt was rightfully theirs. The arrogance of it all struck me hard. They believed that they could simply impose their will on me, and when I didn't comply, they would just throw money or legal threats at me to make me bend. But they didn't understand that I had drawn a line in the sand. I had taken a stand. This wasn't about a trail. This wasn't about the fine. This was about my land, my rights, and my decision to live life on my own terms. I wasn't going to let them dictate the way I lived any longer. I read the letter several times, growing angrier with each pass. The HOA had already fine-tuned their rules to fit their vision of a perfect community, and now they were demanding that I sacrifice my rights for the sake of their vision. But I had had enough. I had no intention of reopening the trails or giving them any more access to my land. They had crossed the line when they imposed their first fine on me. This was my turn to make the rules. With the letter in hand, I gathered my thoughts and prepared for the next step. I wasn't going to let them dictate the terms anymore. Instead of cowering or giving in, I would fight back, on my terms. I called the HOA office, demanding to speak to someone in charge. I wasn't going to waste time with customer service representatives who would just read from a script. I wanted to speak to the president of the HOA, the one who made the decisions. I was done playing by their rules. When I finally got through to the president, the conversation didn't go as he likely expected. He began with the usual pleasantries, but I didn't let him get comfortable. I told him point blank that the trail was closed and that it would stay closed. I told him that the HOA had no jurisdiction over the land anymore. His response was immediate and dismissive, as I had expected. He said that the HOA would take legal action if I didn't reopen the trail, that they had the right to use the land, as they saw fit. But I was ready for him. "I've already closed the trail," I replied, "and I've locked the gate. It's my land now, and you don't have the right to tell me what to do with it." The conversation escalated quickly. He began to make threats, speaking in tones of legal action and potential fines. But I didn't flinch. I had done my research. I knew my rights. Legally, the land was mine, and no amount of paperwork or HOA regulations could change that. I wasn't going to back down. After the phone call ended, I sat in my study, the weight of the situation sinking in. The HOA wasn't going to give up easily, and I knew that this battle was far from over. They would fight tooth and nail to maintain control, but I was ready for whatever they had in store. I had already made my decision, and there was no turning back now. I wasn't just protecting my land, I was protecting my independence, my autonomy, my right to decide what happens on the property that had been in my family for generations. Days turned into weeks, and the HOA's threats continued. They sent more letters, more fines, and more demands for the reopening of the trail. But I stood firm, refusing to let them bully me into submission. I had made my statement, and I wasn't going to let them undo it. The trail stayed closed. The gate remained locked. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of back and forth, the HOA sent a representative to meet with me in person. It was clear that they were trying to find a way to resolve the situation without resorting to more legal action. They offered to pay me a large sum of money in exchange for reopening the trail to the public. Their logic was simple. They wanted access to the land for the community's benefit, and they believed that a financial settlement would make everyone happy. But I wasn't interested in money. I wasn't interested in compromise. I was done negotiating. I met with the representative, but it didn't take long for me to make my position clear. I told them that I would not reopen the trail no matter how much they offered. I had taken control of the land, and I wasn't going to give it up for anything. I had won, not just the fight for my land, but the fight for my right to make decisions about it. The HOA could no longer dictate how I used my property. This was my victory. In the end, the HOA had no choice but to move on. They sought out new land for their hiking trails, and while it took some time, they eventually found a new location for their public access. It wasn't easy for them, but they had no legal standing to argue with me. The land was mine, and I had the right to do with it as I pleased. As I looked out at the land I had fought so hard to protect, I realized that this wasn't just about the trail. It wasn't even about the fine or the conflict with the HOA. This was about something deeper, something more profound. It was about my right to own what was mine, to make decisions about the land, and to stand up for my beliefs, no matter the cost. The HOA may have fined me for hunting, but in the end, I had the last laugh. They had underestimated my resolve, and I had won a battle that I knew would have lasting repercussions. I had reclaimed control, not just over the land, but over my life. I had taken back what was rightfully mine, and nothing could take that away from me. Join the fight for your rights. Subscribe to the HOA stories and never miss a moment of the battle.